organization without slowing down? How can I build an organization that, as I'm going beyond these first 150 employees, still maintains that same speed? And what he came up with is what we call AMPed, which stands for analytics, marketing, product, engineering, and design in every team, right? So Andre said, in order to move quickly, in order to rapidly learn and adjust and be customer-centric, what I need to do is every team needs to be a tiny little startup itself. It needs to be a team that is capable of serving end-to-end a business problem. So we need to have analytics, marketing capabilities, even sales, all these things. Like the acronym quickly ran out, but it's such a beautiful word, so we stuck with it. We need to have these capabilities built into every team so that we can move very, very rapidly. And this is a great setup, because most organizations, when they start to grow, they at some point say, how are we going to organize? You take care of all the marketing people. You take care of all the sales people. You take care of all the product people. You take care of all the engineering people. And we get these line organizations. And you're probably familiar with a game called Telephone or Chinese Whispers, which is really, really fun. You whisper something into somebody's ear, who whispers it into the ear of the person standing next to them, etc., etc., etc. And out the end comes something hilarious, which wasn't something that you started at the start of that chain. Most organizations, and especially organizations that organize into these lines, play a very expensive enterprise game of Chinese whispers. Somebody learned something that the customer wants. They translate that into a marketing exercise. That marketing exercise then is handed over to the product organization, which translates that into everything that needs to do, etc., etc., etc. And by the time you have something that is delivered to the customer, it's not quite what they wanted anymore. And we have this very high cost of communication, and we have this high cost of error in that communication, right? So that's what most companies do. Andre wanted to circumvent that. He said, okay, let's have these amped setup teams, these amped teams. Great. But we had this situation where COVID happened, and not only was money pouring in, but also work was pouring in, right? So we have a situation where we have a great CEO. We have these teams that are autonomous, that are capable of doing many things that are completely customer focused. They're very much looking like value streams. So what's the problem, right? What's the issue going on here? Is there anything that's wrong with this picture? Well, yeah, an interesting thing that happened was that, of course, Miro itself was also suffering from COVID. They were also moving through this exercise. So not only were they adding people at an amazing rate, at some point, they were the quickest growing company ever on the planet. So they were accumulating more people, more revenue, more everything than any other company ever before it. We were also hiring all of these teams, these autonomous teams, in a completely remote situation. So these people we were hiring through video interviews. We were onboarding them through Miro software. All of these people were coming into the organization in a virtual manner. So we had these really autonomous amped teams, all focused on making something for the customer, but all with very high transaction cost of communicating. So all of these teams were communicating with their immediate team members, with all the stakeholders that they needed to communicate with directly. But we did not have any chance communication, because the cost of finding these people and setting up communication was really, really high. So another thing that happened was very quickly, the new people completely outnumbered the existing people. So the culture that made Miro great at the start very rapidly just got outnumbered and dwindled and diluted. So the new people established a new culture. But these people were all in these individual bubbles inside these teams. So they had these local team cultures, and not so much a Miro culture anymore. So what made Miro very quickly changed. It was a very different feel to the organization. So that was something that we needed to get to grips with and to serve and to handle. Another thing that happened was all these teams were doing amazing things. They were all pushing code and changes and features and things. So the tool itself, Miro itself, also rapidly became different, all kinds of new functionality, new tools, not so easy to discover, not so easy to use anymore. So we needed to get to grips with that too. So we now have a perfect storm. We have a lot of people wanting to use Miro, We have a lot of people joining Miro to make Miro better. We have a lot of functionality brewing in the background, and we have a lot of things that are becoming very, very successful very, very rapidly. So that's what we call the hypergrowth situation. I've shown you the curve of the people joining the company, and that was a pretty steep curve. The revenue curve was also pretty much vertical. So also the revenue that was pouring in was healthy. It was a great situation to be in money-wise. But if you're familiar with Crossing the Chasm, this highly recommended book to read. It's about your product life cycle. So your product initially, you're catering towards innovators, people that want the new shiny stuff, people that are happy to experiment, that are on the cutting edge, that want to use these tools, and they are happy with maybe not the best customer support. Maybe they're okay with if the tool drops out every once in a while, right? They're here for the new things. They're here for these innovations and this new way of working. All of these things are good. But what happened in this COVID period was that a lot of large organizations decided to use Miro. It was pretty much driven from the users up, so they decided to just use Miro to organize themselves and to continue working. So what Miro found themselves was having a lot of what's called exceptions. So an enterprise organization, when they select a tool, usually you have to go through a rigorous process. They see if you meet all their criteria. And if you have most of those criteria met and not all of them, you get an exception. You get some amount of time to sort of fix that situation. Thank you, Siri. That's very, very helpful. Sorry about that. Siri decided to join into the conversation. So back to this Crossing the Chasm conversation. Enterprises will give you an exception. Say if you don't meet certain criteria, you have a period of time to deal with that, and then once the business review kicks in, we see whether we are continuing, and then we can move forward. So what Miro was accumulating was a lot of these exceptions. So the Miro at the start of that COVID period wasn't built to serve the enterprise. It wasn't built to serve that market. So when we were rapidly going through our product lifecycle with all the features that we were building, we were also accumulating all these things that we needed to do. So it wasn't so much technical depth, but it was like enterprise depth, things that we needed to fix as we moved onwards. So we now have these teams that are building these features, lots of features. They are going out into the market. They are getting a lot of adoption very, very rapidly. And one of the things that is painful when you cross the chasm is the culture that you need in order to succeed at the start of that market, that early market situation, is not the culture that you need to be successful in the mainstream market. So the people that made your organization successful at the start usually are not the people that make you successful further down the line. But in this case, we had all these teams going through these journeys extremely rapidly. Also, they were on this hockey curve sticks of growth. So we had teams that very rapidly had to change their internal culture to be successful on the market. They also had to change like what they needed to do and how they needed to be successful. The kind of expectations that the market has from you in that early market are completely different from the expectations that the market has once you hit the mainstream. So an enterprise doesn't feature or doesn't value that much innovative solutions. They really enjoy stability and robustness and predictability. So those are the kind of things that you need to tailor towards once you start moving into that space. So we had those teams rapidly crossing the chasm, rapidly moving into that space, and we needed to figure out how can we still be successful? How can we still sustain this growth and sustain this business that we have? And one of the big learnings from Crossing the Chasm in that book is you need to keep delivering, because you have all these demands and you have a lot of money riding on these demands and everything looks really, really important, and you have to start figuring out your priorities and all these things. But it's extremely important that you keep on delivering, that you keep on producing output, that you're not getting bogged down. So one of the things that we did was really focus on what we call the product development lifecycle and said, okay, so we have this first stage when we're trying to figure out, are we investing or betting, whatever you prefer, on the right kind of opportunities? Are we chasing the things that will actually deliver value, that actually make a lot of sense for us to participate in? Because previously all these teams were super autonomous and they were just picking things that they thought they needed to build, and then they started building with the entire team. If you're very small, it makes a lot of sense. If you're just a startup, like that's a great way to find your product market fit. But once you become larger, once you start working with multiple teams on a domain, it doesn't make always a lot of sense to involve the entire team with that. So what we started to do is say, okay, let's split this thing up into a number of steps, what we called going from 0 to 1, finding that first customer, going from 1 to 10, building and optimizing, finding a market for it that's beyond a single customer, and then scaling it out to hundreds and thousands of customers, operating and scaling it. And here we iterate on different problems. There's different risks that we want to manage. So in that early stage, the big risk that you have is innovation risk. Are we building the right thing? Is this actually valuable? So in that space, we really focused on teams saying only write code as a last resort. Only code if there is no other way to validate. Because in this stage, what you can do is you can do customer interviews. You can make paper prototypes. You can make mock-ups. There's all these things that you can do to very quickly validate whether you have found something of value. So that was the first sort of loop that we introduced for all of our product teams. Okay, really, really focus on validating that you're looking at the right opportunity. Convince us that this is worth investing in. Convince us that this is the right thing to spend capacity on. Once we are convinced, once we think this is the right thing to do, and teams use those rapid analysis tools and those rapid loops to figure these things out, okay, build something small. So Miro has a marketplace and they have a platform. So that is a great way to build out something that lives within a Miro context, but doesn't need to go through the full software development lifecycle. Because as you can imagine, we are onboarding all these people, all that talent, all these great engineers. There's a lot of things going on in the background, in the architecture, in the engineering side of things. There is a lot of change happening. There is a lot of new demand coming in. We need to scale out our ability to serve many, many customers at the same time. And Miro is known for its ability to handle large boards. Like it was a high performance tool because very early on they decided in Miro we can never over invest in technical quality. Like performance will always be something worth something to a customer. So they had a very high performance backend, but it was never built for the kind of customers that we now suddenly had to serve. So there was a rigorous process put into place to make sure that we weren't accumulating a lot of technical debt, but that also meant that these flows were a little longer. There were checks that you need to go through. There were conversations that you needed to have. So that's why we really focused in these early stages on circumventing, not really, but just not touching that flow. Say, okay, first build something in a more modular context. Use our own platform to flesh out certain ideas, to bring it to the market to see if they resonate. And once you know that these things are working, then bring them into the core of Miro, then go through that full software development process in the build and optimize phase. And then once you have something that's really working, that really gets picked up by customers, that is really successful, you need to operate and scale it, right? And when you go into that operate and scale mode, it's much more about optimizing your margins. It's not so much about moving very rapidly and building new features and finding product market fit. You have found that before in your build and optimize phase. It's about optimizing what you make with the product. It's optimizing how much revenue can we extract from this. So you need to look at what's the cost of owning this functionality? What's the cost of operating this functionality? Is there any way that we can bring this to a space where we can have cheaper support, less support maybe? So that's another shift that you need to go through. One of the things that we learned in facilitating these shifts and making these things happen was Scrum, less lean, safe, Kanban, it didn't help. Like a lot of these teams that we were working with have previous experience. They think they know Scrum, they think they know Kanban. So when we were introducing these kind of words, they weren't interested in that kind of support. They were not sort of resonating with that. So we completely removed all of this language from our vocabulary internally. We stopped talking about Scrum, we stopped talking about Kanban, and instead we focused on, well, what are the problems that we're actually solving? Let me actually go back because this is a better picture to show that. So Scrum is a tool to manage innovation risk, right? You have a flow of work, and every once in a while, or the cadence, you stop and you inspect and you figure out, are we building the right things? Is this actually what our customers want? So it's a great tool to manage your innovation risk. And that's what we started helping teams with. We said, okay, in that early phases, you have a lot of innovation risk, and we can help you set up processes and a framework and a method of working that will really help you quantify those risks and manage those risks. Once you have those risks under control and you're understanding where you're heading and you know what you want to build, now you need to start having a nice flow to your work. Now you need to make sure that your work is actually flowing as well as you can within your team. And you as professionals recognize this as Kanban. Like, okay, so that's the thing that we now need to introduce. But because we weren't calling it by these regular names, we weren't tapping into their past experiences. Maybe this resonates with you too, but what I find a lot today is that a lot of people have experienced really, really bad Scrum. And then you talk to them and then you realize that that's not Scrum. It was just something branded as Scrum, but you weren't collaborating with the business. You weren't an autonomous team. You were not self-organizing. So you were doing something branded as Scrum, but it's not a good Scrum implementation. And by not sort of triggering that post-traumatic stress, but by having them look at the outcomes of the processes and the tools and the frameworks that we were sort of reaching out to those people, we got a lot of benefits. So the first benefit is they weren't Googling. So they weren't looking into these things and making up their own mind, but they were coming at us with an open mind. So, okay, tell me more about innovation risk. That is actually a problem that I have, and it's something that I'm interested in managing. And then we would walk them through the tools and they would recognize it as Scrum at a certain point, but then they were already so engaged in the conversation that we had them sort of where we wanted them in an open learning mindset. And then we were helping them make a pragmatic Scrum implementation. I don't think anybody ever won by implementing something by the book. That's not really helpful. You need to be super pragmatic and meet them where they are. That's also my stance on SAFe. It's very dominant in the market right now. It's a great place to start. It's a horrible place to end up, right? It's a great place to get you going. But then you need to make it your own and you need to figure out your problems and find your solutions to it. And that's the same thing that we did at Miro. So the other thing that we were sort of working with was there was already plenty of teams there and many more teams were pouring in as we were working with that company, making them succeed. So we needed to also scale ourselves. So what we did was make a team journey, a maturity journey. And we handed that to teams and we said, okay, here's the data that you have within your systems to see where you are. So that helps you figure out roughly what's your starting point. And from that starting point, you can look at certain criteria that you need in order to move on to the next stage. And we basically gave permission to suck. So we said, you don't need to focus immediately on performance, because if your team isn't really a team yet, it's just not going to help you. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to establish whether your team is a group of people or a true team. So if the individuals in the team don't know themselves, they will not be able to embrace the team. So that's step number one. Focus on the individuals in your group of people if that's not where they are yet. Right? We gave them a checklist. We gave them some sort of way to measure where they were. So they could also start at step number 3 if that was their maturity level. So we didn't make them go through unnecessary parts of the process, which was very much appreciated. But the first step was make sure that the individuals within that team know themselves. That they're able to talk about their desires, their fears, the things that they want to achieve in their life, the things that turns them on, the thing that turns them off. That's the first thing that you need to establish. Once you have established that, you need to start looking at how can these individuals form a team? How do we need to come together as individuals with desires and needs and wants and skills and talents? And how do we leverage that in order to achieve the things that we want to achieve as a team? So that's the next port of call that we want those people to focus on. So once you've established that collaboration, then you need to start looking at your team processes. How do you work as a team? How do you make things actually happen? Once you have those things under control, and there was a lot of tools that we could provide within Miro based on telemetry and systems and data to really help those teams understand their work. And a nice thing as an aside was that we also took that data to the team. We did not take that data to the managers or the leaders of the organization. We decided to bring that information to the team and said, okay, what we want to do is to enable you to have great conversations with your leaders. So they will ask you things to build. They will ask you to prioritize certain things. They will ask you about your performance. And we are going to equip you to have these conversations. And we called that outmanage your manager. right? We need to establish the same kind of language, and we need to make you really good as a team to speak that language so that you can have the right kind of conversations that will help you get to the outcomes that you want. So that was working as a team. So the next step is really sort of melting the team together and making them perform, like making them focused on how can we actually build great outcomes and continuously improve. So we had a checklist, and that enabled the people that were on the hook for making these teams exceptionally great. We gave them permission to take it one step at a time. So don't focus on performance immediately. You have a certain journey that you need to make in order to get to high performing teams, and you need to take certain steps, and you need to take certain actions before you're able to talk about performance. People, process, purpose, performance. So that really helped those teams establish like a growth path and a growth scenario, and becoming into a cadence where they became like exceptionally great at doing the things that they needed to do. This was called the Engineering Manager Handbook. So in Miro, the role of the Scrum Master or the team coach, whatever you prefer, was melded with the engineering manager, so the people person. And these were all great engineers at some point in their careers, but they decided to move towards this kind of area. And this was a playbook that we developed for them, where they could self-service, work through a lot of these stages and these maturity journeys. There was a lot of tools and data available in the system to measure where they were and to figure out where they needed to go. And all of these things were obviously integrated into Miro boards. So if you haven't used Miro before, it's not just a whiteboard. One of the cool things that it does is that it also allows you to integrate all kinds of other tools on it. So you can embed graphs, Tableau, queries, graphics, videos, all these things can just work. And we leverage that very, very heavily in these tools. So to give you an example, I can't show it to you because that's not something Miro wants to share, but I can talk you through it. We had something called success factors. So we know from Google research and other areas that psychological safety is really, really important to the performance of teams. We know that having a clear mission is really important for the success of teams, and other things that we know are extremely important. So what we did was we made that measurable. One of the things we made that measurable was that we would just query the team. So how do you feel about the clarity of your mission? And then we gave them a Likert scale 1 to 5, and they rate that. And because it's embedded in the Miro board, they can just pull it up at the start of every retrospective, answer the survey right then and there, no context switching. It just immediately happens on that board, and they immediately get a graph to see, well, what's the condition of our team right now? How do we feel about that? We call that team sentiment. So this is not hard data, but it allows you to very quickly graph how everybody feels in your team. And that starts the conversation on those particular topics, right? You immediately can see where you're doing great. So what are things that you need to do to sustain that greatness? How can we capture that and make sure it doesn't fall by the wayside? Or you can see areas where you need to make further improvements. So, hey, we still are not doing great in this particular area. And because it's data, we get to graph it over time. So we can see, are we actually making progress or are we stagnating? Then teams are having that retrospective. And as they take out their action items, as they figure out what they need to do to try and make an improvement, we taught them immediately to stick this in your ticketing system. This is not something that you do on the side. We are not improving on the side. This is a core part of your job. We want you to handle this with the same diligence and the same processes and the same attention as you do feature work. So your improvement work is maybe even more important. You all know how to find love and become extremely wealthy, I hope, which is by compounding interest, by learning a lot, failing a lot. Right? So these teams, what they need to do is they need to stack improvement on top of improvement, because that really steepens that curve, that it gives you another hockey curve within Miro. If you can make a 5% improvement every 2 weeks, then by the end of the year, you've doubled your thing, whatever it is that you wanted to double. So we really instilled in teams the importance of very frequent retrospectives. If teams were running into issues that they could not resolve and they reached out to the coaching functionality or other support functions within Miro, the common thing that we would do is retro each and every day, because that means that the curve gets even steeper. Each and every day, figure out, did we make an improvement? Did something went better? Are we on the right track? And having these conversations and really, really focusing on those improvements and making them measurable is also exciting, right? You can see the progress. You're not just talking about the problem, you're actually tackling it. So that's also a good takeaway, is make these things visual and work with them in a meaningful manner so you can actually see what's going on. So that's the part that we took at Miro. And with this bit, I want to thank you. That's the bit that I wanted to share with you. So Miro is hiring. If you're interested, go take a look. If you're interested in these things from a better change perspective, we're happy to help. And I'm wondering if there are some questions that you folks have that you might want to discuss.
So thank you, Garbrand, for sharing your experience from Miro and what Miro is doing. And as Garbrand said, please let's open the floor for questions. There are already some in the chat, but we are not a million people here. So maybe just voice up your question, unmute and voice it up, and then and let's hear it.
Yes, okay, yes. I have a question. My name is Søren, and I have some problem with my camera right now. But I have a question. So with so many teams, how do you coordinate changes and just work and still keep Miro being coherent and a simple tool to use?
Yeah, that was a huge challenge. So the main thing that we did was really focus on that first part of the journey. So we said in order to make these kind of decisions, we need to be much more strict, much more focused on what we do and do not invest in, and figure out the impact of the changes that it will have on the tool holistically. So that's why in those early stages we had them flesh out a lot more low fidelity. So we said, draw these things out, make mock-ups, have these conversations to figure out what the impact will actually be. One of the challenges that Miro had was that multiple teams were tackling similar problems. So it's in one area, at one point in time, we had presentations, we had workshops, and we had board sharing. And these things hugely overlapped. And it was quite confusing to the user, like what should I use when? And these things were all built in isolation. And that was one of those things where we said, okay, let's bring those teams together and make a holistic construct again. So we started to build a network of teams and said, these teams are all in similar spaces. Let's bring them together much more closely. Let's have them align more on a strategic level on what the future is going to be for this kind of functionality. And then take that again into the teams and start building these things. So when I said that we at the early stages, we have a lot more focus on, are we building the right opportunity and what solution market fit? That's really the problem that we were trying to solve as well. So we were tackling these things in an earlier stage, getting them to talk to each other, spending less time writing code, which also meant that the design functions and the user experience functions had some more time available to make a strategic direction, to build component kits, to build out an holistic vision of what this kind of functionality was going to be. So we actually reduced a lot of engineering effort in the early stages of product discovery so that we had more strategic time to align these teams and build proper views on the future, more speculative designs.
Interesting. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Maximilian, I see you also have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. So I'm wondering about the challenge of leadership, because in such a decentralized kind of system that you're speaking to and creating kind of atomic teams, let's say, how are you then moving up the ladder, or was there even a ladder? How are you structuring the communication and the leadership across the board?
Yeah, a very good question. So the first thing that Miro has is a very charismatic, very engaged CEO. So the CEO has this really far-reaching vision of what he wants this product to be and how it helps humanity, which is an amazing thing to have in an organization. Most companies have a vision that is kind of wishy-washy. Like, yeah, our company has this vision, but our competitors probably have a very, very similar vision. It doesn't feel uniquely compelling. Miro is something else. Like Miro, the vision is really about shaping humanity and building the future. So it's super, super engaging. So that already aligns the teams to a large extent towards this point on the far horizon. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is that these teams, because they are so autonomous and because they are building all these things, we had them compete on the market. We said, instead of having leadership decisions on where we want to take these things, we are going to share the direction of where we want to go. So we are going to spend a lot of effort and a lot of energy on taking this vision, distilling that into a 3-year plan, breaking down that 3-year plan into a yearly strategy, breaking down this yearly strategy into things that we can actually measure, then really explaining to teams, like, how can you influence these measurements? So Miro has an amazing analytical function and really, really sophisticated data function. So they have great, I would say, data literacy. So teams were really well versed in understanding how can we impact the things that we want to impact. Then we have them pitch these things that they think they need to build. We have them aligned very early on together on, are these the right constellation of features to build and what would the impact be? And then we have them compete out in the market. Like, we would fund these teams for a certain amount of time to prove out this functionality, have them do it on the market without any leader intervention whatsoever, because we had the market speak. If that feature isn't successful, your money runs out, and back into the queue and pick up the next thing. So there was a lot more coordination going on and much less management. So we had leadership at all levels, is what we called it. We had all these people figure out, like, what's the right thing to do? Can you find momentum behind it? Can we enable you to do the things that you need to do? And then, does it fit the architecture of the user experience? Does it fit the architecture of the design? Does it fit the architecture of our vision? Yes, great. All lights are green. Let's go. So we try to remove as many decision-making hurdles as we could. So as little bureaucracy as we could, because bureaucracy kills. The moment you need to go through a meeting in order to make a decision, it's going to slow down, right? So we try to remove as much of that as possible and have leadership at all levels, is what we called it. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I would love to add a little piece. So I imagine in the product-centric focus, which you're speaking to here for the autonomous teams, that, as we know, software companies and people in software companies will go very fast. How did you balance what you shared earlier with establishing a psychological safe environment and really a socially bound and glued together team?
So the good thing with Miro was that they were already very aware of this. Like, we need to establish safety if we want to be innovative. Like, innovation means failure. And that's something that we said really early on. If you're not failing, you're not innovating. You're only doing sure shots. If everything that you do turns into gold, you're not taking any risk, you're not taking any chance, you're leaving a lot of money on the table because somebody else will find this opportunity. And Miro was, of course, in a space where they can afford this mindset, right? They can afford quite a bit of failure. But many companies that maybe you also work with can afford more failure than they realize. Particularly when you work with banking and insurance, they have plenty of money to fail, not an issue. They just don't have something else that sort of makes them want to fail these things. So at Miro, we started calling this the innovation ratio. We told the product people, like, we need you to fail a certain % of your time. You need to have a failure budget. If you are not failing, you are not innovating, you are not doing your job. And this is a tip that I can give you, something that I did very early on in Miro, and I hope something you can do as well. Check the contracts that you have with people. Because that's the real deal. That's the agreement that you have. So if you have values on your wall somewhere that say innovation, customer centricity, and all these other wonderful things, but your contract doesn't reward failure, doesn't reward customer centricity, you're never going to get it, right? So that was the first thing that we did at Miro, or one of the first things that we did at Miro, is sanitize the contracts. Are we actually making agreements with people that reward the behavior that we want to see? Because otherwise we're fighting an uphill battle. It's going to be very, very difficult to introduce the changes that we want to do. It's also very difficult to establish that kind of safety if once a year or once every quarter or whatever you have your performance review conversation, you're getting sort of slapped on the wrist for those kind of things, right? So that was one of those fundamental things that we built in early into the organization. So we again, like we said, the engineering managers had permission to suck for a while. The product managers were not only permissioned to suck and fail, they were steered on failing. And that was a big mind shift for them. Like, initially, of course, everybody wanted to win and succeed and be successful. And we said, you are successful when you're learning. You are successful when you're failing very, very early. So when I showed you that graph in that initial stages, what they were doing was they were building code very early on. We said, why? It's extremely expensive. If you're failing while you're building code, that is very, very expensive. What we want you to do is to use all these other techniques that are available to you to fail super early, learn a lot, and then once you're convinced it's the right thing to do and you can pretty much prove it, great. Then open all that money and bring those people in and make amazing solutions. Then do engineering excellence, do user experience excellence. So those are all the things that you need to do in that space. Right, so it's slightly different animals. It's a slightly different way of looking at how you manage people, how you manage teams, and how you drive things. There were a lot of things that we introduced that were more about failing, moving quickly, and managing that risk accordingly, so that it's okay to fail. Peter, I think you were next, and then I think Morten. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I was really inspired by your way of handling this agile fatigue, that people have seen bad implementations and so forth. And I'm a bit more curious on what you actually did, because it seemed to me like you were building processes up over time. So my questions really are, how much time did you spend to build up the processes for the teams, and how much did you follow a master plan, and how much was it a feedback loop on what was working?
Great question, thank you. It was a two-pronged approach. So we were tackling it from the top down and from the teams up. So the challenge at Miro and in most hypergrowth companies is that it's extremely difficult to manage. So if you have all these autonomous, self-organizing, self-managing teams, they all developed their own language, which was very much amplified by the fact that we were in this Corona space and these teams were operating in these bubbles. They were communicating good within the team, not so great with their immediate teams, and not at all with the rest of the organization, because the cost of communication was extremely high during the COVID period. So in that situation, all these teams developed their own ways of working, their own practices, their own ceremonies. So as the leaders of the organization, when we wanted to interact with those teams, we had to learn almost to speak a new language with every team that we wanted to talk with, because they had all these different sort of modes and thinkings and bits of language that they used. So the first thing that we did was, okay, we're going to make a stable interface between the leadership of the organization and all the teams. And that's what we call the product development lifecycle. That's also where the 0 to 1, 1 to 10, 10 to 100 vocabulary came from. So we said, what we want you to do is first go from 0 to 1, and we want you to present a business case for us to invest in, yes or no. Once we've given you this investment, we want you to start looking at ways to solve for this opportunity. So we want you to start bringing solutions that give us jobs to be done or things that our customers actually want. But we just want to, in layman terms, talk about the things that you will actually do for our customers. Once that is flowing and happening, we want to see whether we need to help you grow, whether we need to establish you for further growth of your team. So extending more engineering practices, giving you other resources to do, etc., etc. So we established a common language at that ultimate top level, and we said this is the same for everybody. We just want everybody to learn how to speak with the leadership of the organization in order to get funding and support, in order to talk to each other. This also included that those data bits and pieces. So we were using a form of OKRs, not quite, but similar to that. We could call them strategic pillars and ways to influence that. And we explained everybody, we spent a lot of effort there, how to leverage data and how to sort of talk to the rest of the organization about what you want to do. So that was coming from the top down into all the teams. Then from the teams upwards, we started to really interview those teams to understand, where are you right now? What are your challenges? Because we tried the regular approach with, hey, here's a Scrum training. Nothing happened, nothing worked. And then we started to realize, like, everybody here thinks they know Scrum. That's usually the case. Like, people think they know Scrum, but usually they don't. It's very rare to find a really healthy, mature Scrum implementation in the wild. But we realized that using that language wasn't getting us anywhere. So then we said, okay, let's translate that into the problems that they actually have, which is innovation, managing their innovation risk, establishing flow and establishing healthy teams, and bring that towards the teams. and repackage what we can offer based on what actually the outcome will be. So we immediately, radically banned the words Scrum, Kanban, Agile. We completely banned those words. We completely scratched that from our dictionaries. We scratched it from our wiki. We scratched it internally, completely eradicated those terms and replaced that with outcomes. So we basically drank our own champagne or ate our own dog food, whatever you prefer. And we said, let's be extremely customer focused, and the customers are our teams. Let's figure out what their needs are, what their pains are, and meet them where they are, and give them the tools in order to expand themselves and grow. And again, we had those teams compete on the market. So we exposed those teams as early as we could and with as little in-betweens to actual customers and to the actual market demands. So all of these teams were facing market pressures and had to fight for their own survival to some extent. So that also changed their attitude towards the help that we were giving them. So they were completely allowed to follow their own process, but we had starter kits. So we said, here are known collections of tools and practices and processes that are integrated with our systems, that are the integrated way of working. If you pick up these, you are completely supported. If you want to develop your own process or use something else, great. We have everything monitored, so we know the performance of these kind of processes. If you want to roll your own, then it needs to be as good as this or better. And if it is, great. We actually adopt it in the excellence organization, and we will now support it. We will do the maintenance, we will write the documentation, we will make the videos, we will bring it to the rest of the organization. But that's how we run it, right? So it was an open system where there were best practices and good practices and supported practices. Those were available to all teams, and they could just grab it and they would get full support. They were completely invited, and actually, we how do you call that? We really wanted those teams to invent their own practices, and then we had these measures in place to see whether these things are helping, whether they were actually performing as good as other teams, and we would enable those and then bring it to other teams. I hope that answers your questions. I would like to take some more questions. Rasmus has 3 hands up, so that's quite a bit. Morten, you have 1. I don't know who was first.
I think it was the order. Yeah, I think it was me. Yeah, so first of all, thanks for sharing all of this amazing information. It's really quite inspiring. I was wondering, you talked about the mind shift in regards to the failing fast and the mind shift that needed to happen.
Yep.
And I was wondering, and I realize it's probably hard to give one answer to this, but how did you work with the management in order for them to adopt this mind shift? It can be quite hard for a leadership team to accept that you need to fail. So I was really quite curious about how you worked with the management team to accomplish that.
Yeah. So the first thing that we did was we didn't call it failure. Like failure is a loaded word. So we said learning. So we called it learning. We need to outlearn the competition. So very early on, I realized that the management at Miro was extremely driven and extremely competitive, which is great. But it's great and it's not great. The great thing about it is it's very easy to play that game. So once you understand that that's what drives those people, like, great, I can use that to sort of make everything a competition. So are you the greatest management team? Are you doing really great? We don't know. Okay, let's figure that one out. So this is true for many organizations. Most management teams are not teams. They just get together every once in a while and they run completely in parallel and not in sync. So that was the first thing that we did at Miro, is bring those people together as a team. Like, do you have a single objective? Are you getting together to sort of work on these things together? And no, we don't. Okay, then you're not the best management team ever. What do you mean we're not the best management team ever? We want to be the best management team ever. Great. So that's how we got them to play that game. So now we have a management team that is starting to act as a team. Then once they start acting as a team, we can start building learning loops. So are you every 2 weeks doing the best that you can, or are you not doing the best that you can? So we ease them into learning. We ease them into that every once in a while you need to do something that is not a sure shot, that is not guaranteed to succeed. And of course, here we had the absolute lucky situation that Andre, the CEO, was a voracious learner, was bought into agility, and was driving his team to play this game. Right? So the CEO was already convinced that failure was a great thing as long as you did it cheaply and early. The rest of the management team we had to take along for the journey, but since Andre is Andre and he was selecting that kind of people that he wanted to work with, I have to say it was already an easy team to work with. It was not the hardest team to get to adopt this mindset. And when I'm honest, if I look back at my career, usually the C-suite isn't that hard to convince of these kind of things because they're used to working with investors, and investors are great at playing this game. They know that for every 12 companies they invest in, only one will succeed, but that will pay back easily for the 11 failed investments. Right, so usually those are not the people that are difficult to get to grips with this. It's more the people that are directly underneath those people, the director level, the executive level, that are adverse to failure. And usually because there's bonuses tied into that, and because their contracts are not sort of set up to fail. Right, so again, we looked at all those contracts too, and we said this is not helpful. The way we are sort of rewarding that behavior is not conducive to the outcomes that we want to see. So that was another change that we made. And something as well that ties into that, while we're on the subject, also something that we established at Miro is you succeed as a team, you perform as a team, not as an individual. So performance we started to measure at the team level, and growth we started to measure at the individual level. Are you growing as an individual to support your team? If so, great, you're doing the best you can and you're on the right trajectory. But you can be an amazing contributor, and if your team sucks, the outcome is still going to suck. So it doesn't matter that you're going to push even harder for personal success. Doesn't help. So we really brought it back to teams and constellations of teams, and again make them perform in the market to prove that they were actually doing well. And that really helped also with the learning and the failure, because then we could show the cost of failure. And then it was like, it's much easier to fail very early on, cheaply learn and adapt, and then we can outlearn the competition and be much more successful much earlier. So I hope that answers your question. I would also like to give Rasmus a moment to ask a question.
Yeah. During this session, you have said we a lot.
Yeah.
Who is we?
We is the agile function inside Miro. So
say again?
The agile function in Miro.
Okay, and can you speak a little about that?
Yeah.
How big is it?
It's quite small. Would have always liked to have more people there, obviously. So there was a couple of functions that we merged together in what we call the product engineering excellence function, because that's where it started. We really started in the engine room of the organization, as I call it. And that was 12 people serving 3,000. So that was slim. And that's also why we really needed to scale our ability to serve those people. And that's why we had all these checklists and journeys and self-service offerings to make those people change and grow. So we heavily relied on training the trainer, coaching the coach, working with constellations and networks to grow in order to make those people move. We had something called the Miro Dojo, which was a space where we had teams learn, record, and then share those best practices out to the rest of Miro. So we had a lot of asynchronous learnings and people sharing best practices and good practices and failures. Fuck Up Friday was a classic thing at Miro. So what was the biggest, most spectacular thing that exploded in our face, and what did we learn? And that was actually something that we celebrated. If it didn't kill the company, we must have learned an amazing thing, right? And that was how we started to make a movement, as Andre called it. Right? We needed to get those people to move in a certain direction and have them be supported. We also had quite a bit of engineering support, to be honest, so a lot of data and things to actually have those people see the impact of the things that they were doing. I hope that answers your question.
Yep.
So that leaves us 1 minute in the hour that we have, and I would like to take that to thank you all for spending a morning coffee with me. Very much appreciated. So I'll share the board so you can have a look. There are some links on there. Our chief product officer goes into depth into how the product function was organized at Miro in the podcast that I've shared. So that if you want to learn more, I highly recommend taking a look. It's a very nice summary of how they were organized and what made it so different. If you want to get in touch, I'm not a great social media person, but I am on LinkedIn, so that's always a great place to try and find me. And if you need better change, that's a great company. Get in touch with those folks. They might be able to help you with your challenges. Thank you so much for having a morning coffee with me. Jan, thank you for inviting me. Very much fun for me. Thank you.